morning sun cut through the pines along Cloud Spine Ridge like copper wire, bright and unforgiving. Harper Keene stood at the trailhead parking lot, staring at the weathered wooden sign that marked the beginning of the path her brother had walked 18 years ago. The air smelled like dry earth and resin, sharp enough to sting her nostrils. She'd driven 6 hours from Denver through the night, arriving just as dawn broke over the Rockies, and now the silence of the mountains pressed against her ears like water. She was alone. That had been deliberate. Harper adjusted the straps of her backpack and glanced at the trail register box mounted beside the sign. It was newer than the one from 1987, replaced twice over by the Forest Service, but the ritual remained the same. She flipped open the metal lid and signed her name with the stubby pencil chained inside. Harper Keene, solo hike, July 14, 2005. The same date Daniel and Mariah had signed in, almost 2 decades prior. She'd seen the photocopy of that page so many times she could recite every name above and below theirs. Daniel Keene and Mariah Keene, day hike, expected return Sunday evening. They never made it back. Harper closed the register and started up the trail. The path was narrow at first, winding through dense lodgepole pine and Douglas fir, the forest floor carpeted in rust-colored needles. Her boots crunched softly with each step. She'd hiked this trail 3 times before over the years, always with someone else, once with her father before he passed, once with a private investigator she'd hired and couldn't afford, and once with a documentary crew that never finished their project. But today, she needed to be alone with it, alone with the mountain, alone with the silence Daniel and Mariah had walked into. The official story had always been clean, almost too clean. The couple had set out on a Saturday morning in July of 1987. Experienced hikers, well-equipped, good weather. They signed the register at 9:30 a.m. and told friends they'd be home in Boulder by Sunday night for a barbecue. When they didn't show, those friends called the sheriff. Search and rescue mobilized Monday morning. They found Daniel's truck still parked at the trailhead, keys locked inside, nothing disturbed. 2 days later, a volunteer spotted a crushed plastic water bottle near a rocky overlook about 4 miles up the trail, and a candy wrapper, Mariah's favorite brand, tucked into a crevice nearby. The search captain concluded they'd ventured too close to the edge, lost footing, and fallen into one of the ravines that dropped hundreds of feet below the ridge. The terrain was brutal, sheer drop-offs, dense brush, scree fields that could swallow a body and never give it back. After 2 weeks of combing the area with dogs, helicopters, and rappelling teams, they called it off. Unrecoverable. The mountains had taken them, and the mountains weren't giving them back. Harper had been 16 when it happened. A sophomore in high school, obsessed with track and terrible poetry, still young enough to believe adults had answers. She remembered the vigil her mother organized, the way the candles flickered in the parking lot of their church, the sheriff's deputy with kind eyes who told her that sometimes the wilderness just wins. She remembered nodding, pretending to accept it, while something cold and sharp settled in her chest. It had lived there ever since. The trail began to climb. Harper's calves burned as the incline steepened, her breath coming shorter in the thin mountain air. She was 34 now, lean and strong from years of running and hiking. But altitude was altitude. The trees thinned as she gained elevation, opening up to views of the valley below. A patchwork of green meadows and silver streams. The town of Ridgemont barely visible as a smudge of rooftops in the distance. It was beautiful in the way dangerous things often are. She stopped at a flat section of trail to drink water and check her map. 4 miles in, another 2 to the overlook where they'd found the bottle. She'd brought copies of everything. The search reports, the topographic maps marked with grid lines and search zones, the interviews with the last hikers who'd seen them. A retired couple from Texas had passed Daniel and Mariah around noon that Saturday, halfway up the trail. They remembered them clearly. Young, happy, the woman laughing at something the man said. No signs of distress. No indication anything was wrong. Harper folded the map and kept moving. The forest here was older, the trees towering and spaced farther apart, their trunks scarred by fire and wind. She passed a rotting log covered in shelf mushrooms, bright orange against the gray wood. A Clark's nutcracker called from somewhere above, its harsh cry echoing off the rock faces. The sun climbed higher, and with it the heat. Sweat soaked through her shirt, sticking it to her back. She tried to imagine what Daniel had been thinking that day. He'd been 24, just graduated from Colorado State with a degree in forestry, newly married, full of plans. Mariah was 23, a photographer who sold prints at craft fairs, quiet and thoughtful in a way that balanced Daniel's energy. Harper had adored her. They'd been married less than a year when they disappeared, still in that phase where they finished each other's sentences and held hands in public without self-consciousness. The trail curved around a massive granite outcropping, and suddenly the overlook came into view. Harper's steps slowed. This was the place. She recognized it from the search photos, though the Forest Service had added a wooden railing since then, a concession to liability. The ground dropped away just beyond the rail, a dizzying plunge into a ravine choked with scrub oak and talus. She approached carefully and looked down. The official theory was that they'd climbed over or around the railing or whatever barrier had existed in 1987 to get a better view or take a photo, and one of them had slipped. The other, trying to help, had gone over too. It was possible. Harper had spent years turning it over in her mind, testing it for holes. People died in the mountains every year doing exactly that. But it had never sat right. Daniel was cautious. He'd worked summers as a wildfire lookout, knew the backcountry, respected it, and Mariah had a mild fear of heights. She wouldn't have gone near the edge voluntarily. Harper had said as much to the investigators, but they'd nodded sympathetically and written it off as denial. Grief makes us irrational, they'd implied. We want complicated answers because simple ones feel cruel. But Harper wasn't irrational. She was thorough. She pulled out her notebook, the same one she'd been filling for 18 years, and flipped to the page with the timeline. 9:30 a.m. Signed trail register. Noon. Spotted by Texas couple at mile marker 3. After that, nothing. No one else saw them. The search teams estimated they would have reached this overlook by 1 or 2 p.m. The crushed water bottle was found 15 feet from the edge, partially hidden under a stone. The candy wrapper was tucked into a crack in the rock as if placed there deliberately or blown by wind. Harper knelt and ran her fingers over the stone where the wrapper had been found. The rock was rough, pitted by weather. She tried to picture Mariah standing here, unwrapping a candy bar, maybe tucking the wrapper away because she never littered. Then what? A stumble? A scream? Or something else entirely? She stood and scanned the area. The trail continued past the overlook, winding higher toward the ridge's summit. Most day hikers turned back here, but the path went on for another 6 miles, eventually looping back down through a different drainage. Daniel and Mariah had planned a full loop, according to their friends. They should have been back by late afternoon, early evening at the latest. Harper checked her watch. It was just past noon. She'd made good time. She could push on to the summit and still have hours of daylight for the return. But something made her hesitate. She looked back down the trail, then up toward the ridge. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of pine and something else. Dust, maybe, or distant rain. She decided to keep going. The trail grew steeper and rockier as it climbed toward the ridge. Harper's lungs worked harder, her heart thudding in her chest. The trees gave way to alpine meadows dotted with wildflowers, Indian paintbrush, lupine, columbine in shades of purple and white. It was stark and stunning, the kind of landscape that made you feel small. She passed a marmot sunning itself on a boulder, its whistle sharp and urgent as she approached. At mile 7, the trail reached a saddle between 2 peaks. Harper stopped to rest, pulling off her pack and sitting on a flat rock. From here she could see both sides of the ridge, the valley she'd climbed from, and on the other side, a different drainage, wilder and less traveled. The official search had focused mostly on the area around the overlook and the ravines below it. They'd sent teams along the main trail, of course, but the assumption had always been that Daniel and Mariah hadn't made it this far. But what if they had? Harper drank more water and ate a granola bar, chewing slowly. She'd read every search report, every witness statement, every scrap of documentation she could get her hands on. She'd filed Freedom of Information requests, pestered retired deputies, even tracked down the volunteer who'd found the water bottle. Everyone told the same story. Tragic accident, terrible luck, but not uncommon in these mountains. Move on. Let them rest. She couldn't, because there were details that didn't fit. Small things, easily dismissed individually, but taken together they formed a pattern that bothered her. The water bottle had been crushed flat, not just dropped. The candy wrapper was clean, not weathered, even though it had supposedly been there for 2 days before anyone found it. And then there was the timing. The search had started Monday morning, more than 36 hours after Daniel and Mariah were last seen. 36 hours is a long time in the backcountry. Harper finished her granola bar and stood. The wind was stronger up here, cold despite the sun. She pulled on a fleece and started down the backside of the ridge, following the trail as it descended into the eastern drainage. This section was less maintained, the path narrower and overgrown in places. She had to watch her footing, stepping carefully over exposed roots and loose rocks. She was about a mile down from the saddle when she heard it. A low rumble like distant thunder, but the sky was clear. Harper stopped, listening. The rumble grew louder, and then she felt it through her boots. Vibration, deep and rhythmic. Rock slide. She looked up just in time to see the slope above her shift. Loose scree and boulders began to move, slowly at first, then faster, a cascade of stone and dust pouring down the mountainside. Harper didn't think, she ran. The trail curved ahead, hugging the slope, no room to maneuver. She sprinted forward, the roar of falling rock deafening now, dust choking the air. A boulder the size of a refrigerator crashed past her, missing by feet, and she dove sideways off the trail. She hit the ground hard, rolling, her pack slamming into her shoulders. The world was noise and chaos, stone thundering past, and then she was falling. Not far, maybe 10 feet, into a narrow cleft in the rock she hadn't seen. She landed on her side, the impact knocking the wind from her lungs. For a long moment, Harper lay still, gasping, her ears ringing. Dust hung in the air, thick and acrid. She coughed, her ribs aching, and slowly sat up. She was in a small, shallow depression, hidden from the trail above by an overhang of rock. The rock slide had poured past, leaving a fresh scar of displaced stone, but the cleft had sheltered her. She took inventory, bruised ribs, scraped palms, a goose egg forming on her shin but nothing broken. Her pack had stayed on, though one strap was torn. She'd been lucky. Incredibly, impossibly lucky. Harper stood carefully, testing her weight. The cleft was maybe 15 feet across, shaped like a shallow bowl, its floor covered in dirt and pine needles. It looked like it had been here for decades, eroded out of the mountainside, hidden from view. She turned slowly, letting her eyes adjust to the dimmer light. That's when she saw it. Wedged into a crack in the rock, half buried in dirt, was a metal box. It was olive green, roughly the size of a shoebox, and covered in rust. Harper's breath caught. She knelt and pulled it free, her hands shaking. The box was heavy, an old military ammo can, the kind surplus stores sold for cheap. The latch was corroded but still intact. She set it on the ground and stared at it. Her mind was racing, trying to make sense of what she was looking at. This was off-trail, hidden, untouched for who knew how long. She felt a prickle of unease, a sense that she was about to cross a line she couldn't uncross. Harper took a breath and opened the latch. The lid resisted, then gave way with a metallic screech. Inside, protected by the sealed box, were objects that shouldn't exist. Harper's vision narrowed, her pulse hammering in her ears. A wristwatch. Silver, with a cracked face and a leather band darkened by age. She recognized it instantly. Daniel's Timex, the one their father had given him for graduation. A pendant. Gold, engraved with tiny flowers, hanging from a delicate chain. Mariah's. Harper had been with her when she bought it at a craft fair in Boulder, 2 months before the wedding. And beneath them, a stack of Polaroid photographs. Harper's hands trembled as she lifted the photos. The top image showed Daniel and Mariah, side by side, sitting on the ground against a rough wooden wall. Their faces were pale, eyes wide with fear. Daniel's hands were bound in front of him with what looked like zip ties. Mariah's mouth was covered with duct tape. Harper flipped to the next photo. Same scene, but Daniel was looking directly at the camera now, his expression a mixture of terror and defiance. Mariah's eyes were closed, her head tilted down. The third photo showed a different angle. A dirt floor, wooden beams overhead, a small window, high up, letting in a shaft of daylight. Harper's breath came in short gasps. She flipped through the rest. 6 photos total, each more damning than the last. In one, someone had written a date on the white border in ballpoint pen, July 18th, 1987. 4 days after Daniel and Mariah signed the trail register. 2 days after the search had officially begun. Harper sat back, the photos clutched in her shaking hands. Her mind reeled, trying to process what this meant. They hadn't fallen. They hadn't died on the mountain that Saturday. They'd been taken, held somewhere, alive. And someone had hidden the evidence here, in a place no one would ever think to look. Harper sat in the shallow cleft for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, her mind cycling through shock, disbelief, and a cold, clarifying rage. The Polaroids lay spread across her lap like evidence at a crime scene, which is exactly what they were. She forced herself to look at each one again, methodically this time, searching for details she might have missed in her initial horror. The wooden wall behind Daniel and Mariah wasn't painted. Rough-cut planks, old and weathered, with gaps between them where darkness showed through. The floor was packed dirt, uneven, with what looked like straw or dried grass scattered in patches. In 2 of the photos, the edge of a metal bucket was visible in the corner. The light coming through the high window was natural, slanting at an angle that suggested late afternoon or early morning. Harper pulled out her phone to take pictures of the Polaroids, but there was no signal this deep in the drainage. She'd have to wait until she got back to civilization. She examined the handwriting on the dated photo more closely. The numbers were written in blue ballpoint pen, slightly smudged but legible, 7/18/87. The handwriting was neat, almost careful, as if whoever wrote it wanted to document the moment. That detail chilled her more than anything else. This wasn't random violence or panicked chaos. Someone had taken these photos deliberately, dated them, and then hidden them away in a waterproof container on a mountainside where they might never be found. Harper carefully placed the Polaroids back in the ammo box along with the watch and pendant, then sealed it shut. Her hands had stopped shaking, replaced by a focused determination she recognized from years of refusing to let this case die. She pulled out her notebook and began writing everything down. The exact location of the cleft, the condition of the box, descriptions of each item, her observations about the photos. She sketched a rough map showing where she was in relation to the main trail and the saddle above. The sun had shifted while she'd been sitting there, and she realized with a start that it was mid-afternoon. She needed to get moving. The trail back would take hours, and she couldn't afford to be caught on the mountain after dark, not with what she was carrying. Harper stood, testing her bruised ribs, and carefully secured the ammo box in her backpack, wrapping it in a fleece to keep it from shifting. Getting out of the cleft proved harder than falling into it. The walls were steep and slick with loose dirt. Harper had to find handholds in the rock, pulling herself up inch by inch until she could see over the edge. The rockslide had transformed the landscape above her. The trail was buried under fresh debris for a 30-foot stretch. The slope above still unstable and threatening. She'd have to pick her way around it carefully. It took 20 minutes to navigate back to stable ground. Harper moved slowly, testing each step, hyper-aware of how easily the mountain could kill her if she made a mistake. When she finally regained the trail beyond the slide zone, she stopped to catch her breath and reassess her route. Going back the way she came, over the saddle and down past the overlook, would take hours. But there was another option. Continue down the eastern drainage to where it met Forest Road 347, an old logging road that eventually connected to the highway. It would be faster, though the trail was rougher and less traveled. Harper checked her map. The eastern route would save her at least 2 hours if she pushed hard. She made the decision quickly and started down, moving at a pace just short of reckless, driven by an urgency she couldn't quite name. The ammo box in her pack seemed to grow heavier with each step, as if the weight of what it contained was more than just metal and paper. The trail descended steeply through dense forest, switchbacking down the mountainside. Harper's knees ached from the constant downward pressure, but she didn't slow. Her mind was already racing ahead, planning her next moves. She needed to get these items to the police, but which police? The original investigation had been handled by the Ridgemont County Sheriff's Department, but that was 18 years ago. How many of those deputies were even still working? And would they take her seriously? Or would they see her as the obsessive sister who'd never been able to let go? She thought about calling her mother first, but dismissed the idea immediately. Barbara Keene had remarried 12 years ago and moved to Arizona, putting physical and emotional distance between herself and the mountains that had taken her son. She'd asked Harper more than once to stop investigating, to let Daniel rest in peace. Finding out he might have been alive for days after everyone thought he was dead would destroy her. No, Harper needed to handle this carefully. She needed someone who would listen, who would understand the significance of what she'd found. Her mind went to Detective Ray Holcomb, one of the original investigators on the case. He'd retired 5 years ago, but Harper had stayed in touch with him sporadically over the years. He'd been one of the few people who'd never made her feel crazy for refusing to accept the accident theory, even if he'd never quite agreed with her either. The forest began to thin as Harper lost elevation, the pines giving way to scrub oak and juniper. She could hear water running somewhere below. The creek that drained this side of the ridge, swollen with snowmelt even this late in summer. The trail crossed it on a narrow footbridge that looked like it hadn't been maintained in years. The planks gray and splitting. Harper tested her weight before crossing, the wood creaking ominously under her boots. On the far side, the trail widened and flattened, following the creek downstream. This section was easier, and Harper increased her pace to something close to a jog. Her mind kept returning to the Polaroids, to Daniel's face in those images. He'd looked terrified, but also angry, defiant. That was pure Daniel. Even in the worst circumstances, he wouldn't break easily. And Mariah, with her eyes closed in some of the photos, as if by not looking at the camera, she could deny what was happening. Harper's throat tightened. For 18 years, she'd held on to hope that they'd somehow survived, that they'd wandered off the trail with amnesia or fallen into a hidden valley where they'd built a life away from civilization. Absurd fantasies, the kind grief manufactures to protect itself. But the reality was worse. They'd been taken, held captive. And then what? The photos ended on July 18th. What happened after that? The trail emerged from the forest onto an old logging road, exactly where Harper's map indicated. The road was overgrown with weeds, deep ruts carved into the hard-packed dirt from decades of erosion. Harper turned right, heading downhill toward the highway. The sun was lower now, casting long shadows through the trees. She checked her watch, 4:30. She'd been on the mountain for 7 hours. Her truck was parked at the Cloud Spine Ridge trailhead on the other side of the mountain, but that didn't matter now. She'd hitch a ride or call a cab from Ridgemont, come back for the truck later. Getting the ammo box to safety was the priority. Harper walked for another hour before the logging road intersected with pavement, a 2-lane county highway that wound through the foothills. There was no shoulder, just gravel and a steep drop-off on one side, thick forest on the other. She stood at the intersection, breathing hard, her legs trembling from exhaustion. The highway was empty in both directions. She pulled out her phone. 1 bar of signal. It flickered but held. Harper dialed Ray Holcomb's number from memory. He answered on the 3rd ring, his voice rough with age but still sharp. "Holcomb. Ray, it's Harper Keene." There was a pause. "Harper, it's been, 2 years? How are you?" "I'm on Highway 347 about 10 miles west of Ridgemont. I need you to come get me." His tone shifted immediately. "What's wrong? Are you hurt?" "No, I'm okay, but I found something." On the mountain, something about Daniel and Mariah. Another pause, longer this time. Harper, I'm not imagining things, Ray. I found physical evidence, items that belonged to them, and photographs, Polaroids from 4 days after they disappeared. She heard him take a sharp breath. 4 days after? July 18, 1987. Someone took pictures of them bound and alive and then hid them in an ammo box off the trail. I have them with me now. I need you to see this. The line was quiet except for the sound of Ray moving, papers rustling. Where exactly are you? Harper gave him the location as precisely as she could, using landmarks visible from the road. Ray told her to stay put, that he'd be there in 20 minutes. He didn't ask her any more questions, didn't challenge her or suggest she was mistaken. That simple acceptance nearly broke her composure. Thank you, she said quietly. Don't thank me yet. Just stay safe. And Harper, don't call anyone else until we talk. He hung up. Harper pocketed her phone and sat down on the gravel shoulder, her back against a mile marker post. The evening air was cooling rapidly, the temperature dropping as the sun slipped toward the horizon. She hugged her knees and stared at the empty highway, trying to organize her thoughts. If Daniel and Mariah were alive on July 18th, they'd been held somewhere for at least 4 days. The structure in the photos looked like a shed or cabin, something rural and isolated. The mountain had hundreds of old mining claims, abandoned homesteads, hunting cabins scattered through the backcountry. Finding the exact location would be nearly impossible without more information. But someone knew. Someone had taken those photos, hidden that box. Someone had been on Cloud Spine Ridge 18 years ago with a plan. This wasn't opportunistic. You didn't hike into the wilderness with zip ties and duct tape unless you intended to use them, which meant the abduction was premeditated. Daniel and Mariah had been targeted. But why? They were young, not wealthy. No enemies that Harper knew of. Daniel had been a forestry student with a part-time job at a camping supply store. Mariah sold photographs at weekend markets. They lived in a small apartment in Boulder. Drove a 15-year-old truck, had student loans and dreams of buying land somewhere in the mountains. There was nothing about them that should have attracted violence. Unless it wasn't about who they were, but where they were. Wrong place, wrong time. They'd signed that trail register, advertised their presence and their plans to anyone who cared to look. Someone could have watched them leave, followed them up the trail, waited until they were far enough from help. Harper closed her eyes, trying to imagine the scenario. Daniel and Mariah hiking, laughing, unaware. Reaching the overlook, maybe stopping for a snack. The candy wrapper. Someone approaching. A weapon? There'd been no signs of struggle in the official reports, but those reports had assumed an accident. If someone had held them at gunpoint, forced them off the trail, they might have gone quietly, hoping for a chance to escape later. The sound of an engine pulled Harper from her thoughts. She stood as a silver Toyota 4Runner appeared around the bend, slowing as it approached. Ray Holcomb pulled onto the shoulder and got out. He looked older than Harper remembered. He'd be in his early 70s now, his hair completely white, his face deeply lined from decades of sun and stress. But his eyes were still sharp, still skeptical in the way good detectives were. "Get in," he said, not bothering with pleasantries. Harper climbed into the passenger seat, settling her pack between her feet. Ray pulled back onto the highway without a word, heading toward Ridgemont. They drove in silence for several minutes before he finally spoke. "Tell me everything. From the beginning." Harper did. She described hiking the trail on the anniversary, the rock slide falling into the cleft, finding the ammo box, opening it, the watch, the pendant, the Polaroids. She kept her voice steady, factual, the way she'd learned from watching him work interviews years ago. Ray listened without interrupting, his hand steady on the wheel, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then, "You have the box with you?" "In my pack. Don't let it out of your sight. When we get to my place, I want to see everything before we decide our next move." "Our next move should be calling the sheriff's department." Ray shook his head. "Not yet. Think about it, Harper. This case has been closed for 18 years. The current sheriff wasn't even working here in '87. He transferred in from Grand Junction about 10 years ago. He doesn't know Daniel and Mariah, doesn't know you, and has no reason to believe this isn't some elaborate hoax or coincidence. But the evidence needs context. We need to build a case before we walk into that office, or they'll dismiss you as a grieving sister who found some old junk in the woods and convinced herself it means something. Harper wanted to argue, but she knew he was right. She'd spent 18 years being dismissed as the girl who couldn't accept reality. She needed to be smarter now. Ray lived in a small ranch house on the outskirts of Ridgemont, a tidy property with a well-maintained yard and a detached garage. He pulled into the driveway and led Harper inside. The house smelled like coffee and old paper, the walls lined with bookshelves and framed commendations from his years in law enforcement. Ray cleared the dining table and gestured for Harper to set down the ammo box. She placed it carefully on the table and opened it. Ray pulled on a pair of reading glasses and leaned over, studying the contents without touching them. Harper watched his face, saw the moment recognition hit, his expression shifting from professional curiosity to something harder, darker. "That's definitely Daniel's watch," he said quietly. "I remember it from the missing persons report. His mother mentioned it specifically, and the pendant is Mariah's. I was with her when she bought it." Ray picked up the stack of Polaroids with careful fingers, holding them by the edges. He examined each one slowly, his jaw tightening. When he reached the dated photo, he set it aside and pulled a magnifying glass from a drawer. He studied the handwriting for a long minute. "This changes everything," he said finally. "Everything we thought we knew about what happened that weekend was wrong. So what do we do?" Ray set down the magnifying glass and looked at her. "We investigate. Properly. The same way I would have if I'd had this evidence in 1987. We document everything, we research, we build a timeline. And when we're ready, we take it to the authorities with enough information that they have no choice but to reopen the case. That could take days, weeks. Better than rushing in and having them shut us down in hours." He gestured to the Polaroids. "These photos show they were alive on the 18th, but we don't know what happened after that. We don't know where they were held or by whom. All we know is someone went to great lengths to hide this evidence, which means whoever did this is still out there, and they've been free for 18 years. Harper felt the weight of that settle over her. 18 years. Whoever had abducted Daniel and Mariah could be anywhere by now, across the country, dead, living a normal life. The trail was ice cold, but it wasn't gone. "Where do we start?" she asked. Ray pulled out a legal pad and pen. "We start with what we know. The photos were hidden in that cleft off the eastern drainage. That location wasn't random. It's far enough off the trail that casual hikers would never find it, but accessible enough that someone could get to it without specialized climbing gear. So we're looking for someone familiar with that area of the mountain, a local. Most likely, someone who knew the terrain, knew the search patterns, knew where to hide evidence. That narrows it down considerably." Ray made a note. Next, the Polaroids themselves. In 1987, instant cameras were common, but developing regular film was still the norm. Using Polaroids suggests the person didn't want to risk dropping film off at a photo lab where someone might see the images. So someone cautious, methodical. Exactly. This wasn't impulsive. They planned ahead. Ray tapped the pen against the pad. The date on the photo, July 18th. That was a Saturday, 4 days after Daniel and Mariah disappeared. The search was still active then, but the focus had already shifted to recovery rather than rescue. By that point, most people assumed they were dead. But these photos prove they weren't. On the 18th, they weren't. What happened after that, we don't know. Ray's expression was grim. "But Harper, you need to prepare yourself for the likelihood that Daniel and Mariah didn't survive much longer. These photos might be the last record of them alive." Harper nodded, her throat tight. She'd lived with that probability for 18 years. Finding proof they'd been alive longer than anyone thought didn't change the ultimate outcome, but it changed the why and the who, and that meant justice might finally be possible. Ray stood and walked to a filing cabinet in the corner. He pulled out a thick folder and brought it back to the table. "This is my personal copy of the case file. I kept it when I retired. Let's cross-reference what we know with what was documented back then and see if any connections jump out." They worked through the evening and into the night, spreading papers across the table, building timelines, marking maps. Ray ordered pizza that neither of them had much appetite for. Harper's exhaustion from the hike faded, replaced by an electric focus. Every detail mattered. Every connection could be the one that broke the case open. Around midnight, Ray leaned back and rubbed his eyes. "We should call it for tonight. You need rest and I need time to think about next steps." Harper wanted to protest, but her body was starting to shut down. Ray set her up in his guest room, and she fell asleep almost immediately, still wearing her hiking clothes, the ammo box locked in Ray's gun safe downstairs. She dreamed of the mountain, of walking the trail and finding the cleft over and over, each time opening the box to find something different inside. Sometimes it was empty. Sometimes it held bones. Once it held a Polaroid of herself, bound and frightened, dated yesterday. She woke before dawn, disoriented and sweating. The house was quiet. Harper got up and found Ray already awake in the kitchen, coffee brewing, the case file spread across the counter. "Couldn't sleep either?" she asked. He shook his head. "I keep thinking about the structure in those photos, the wooden walls, the high window, the dirt floor. I know I've seen places like that around here. Old mining cabins, hunting shacks. There are dozens of them scattered through these mountains. Too many to search. Maybe. But back in '87, we interviewed everyone who had property or permits within 10 miles of that trailhead. Homeowners, ranchers, outfitters, mining claim holders. Someone on that list might be worth a second look." Harper poured herself coffee and sat down. "You still have those interviews?" "In the file. Names, addresses as of 1987, notes from the conversations." Ray pulled out a sheaf of papers. "Most people were cooperative, let us search their properties if they were anywhere near the search zone. A few pushed back, invoked their rights, but nothing that raised red flags at the time. And now? Now we have different information. Now we know someone held Daniel and Mariah somewhere close enough to the mountain to hike in and hide that box. That means we're looking for someone with property in the area, someone who could come and go without raising suspicion." Harper took the papers and started reading. The list was long, over 50 names. Most had been cleared quickly, their alibis solid or their properties thoroughly searched. But a few had notes in the margins, Ray's handwriting from 18 years ago raising questions that had never been fully answered. One name caught her attention: Marcus Vare. 43 years old in 1987, owned a 50-acre parcel on the east side of the ridge, about 3 miles from where Harper had found the cleft. The notes indicated he'd been interviewed twice, cooperative but evasive, about his activities the weekend of the disappearance. The search team had requested access to his property, but Vare had declined, citing privacy concerns. Without probable cause, they'd had no grounds to insist. "Who's Marcus Vare?" Harper asked, pointing to the name. Ray leaned over to look. His expression darkened. "I remember him. Reclusive guy, Vietnam vet, lived alone in a cabin on his property. He'd had a few run-ins with the law over the years, trespassing complaints, a bar fight in the '80s, but nothing major. When we interviewed him about Daniel and Mariah, he claimed he'd been off the mountain that whole weekend, down in Denver visiting family. Did you verify that?" "We tried. The family he claimed to visit didn't remember him being there, but they weren't certain either. It was July, a month later by the time we tracked them down. People's memories were fuzzy." Harper felt a prickle of certainty. "This is him. I know it." "Don't jump ahead," Ray cautioned. "We need evidence, not intuition." But Harper was already pulling out her phone, searching for Marcus Vare's name. The results were sparse. An obituary from 2003 listing him as deceased at age 59, no surviving family, interred at Ridgemont Cemetery, dead for 2 years. If he'd been involved, taking him to trial was impossible. But the property, the cabin, those might still exist. "We need to go there," Harper said. "To his property, See if the cabin matches the photos. Ray was quiet, considering. Finally, he nodded. Not today. Today we document everything, make copies, secure the evidence. Tomorrow, we'll take a drive out there, quietly. If that property looks promising, then we bring in the authorities. Harper agreed, though waiting felt like torture. But Ray was right. They needed to be methodical. One mistake now could destroy any chance of justice. They spent the rest of the day working. Ray photographed the Polaroids from every angle, made detailed notes about the condition of the ammo box, documented the exact GPS coordinates of where Harper had found it. Harper wrote out a comprehensive statement of events, including every detail she could remember. By evening, they had a case file that would be impossible to dismiss. The sun was setting when Ray finally leaned back and declared them done for the day. Tomorrow morning, we'll drive out to Vare's old property. Are you ready for whatever we might find? Harper thought about Daniel's face in those photos, about 18 years of unanswered questions, about the mountain that had kept its secrets for so long. I've been ready for 18 years, she said. They left Ray's house just after dawn, the sky still pink and gray above the foothills. Harper had barely slept, her mind cycling through possibilities and fears, imagining what they might find at Marcus Vare's property. Ray drove his 4Runner, and Harper rode beside him in silence, watching the landscape roll past. The coffee Ray had made sat cooling in a travel mug between her knees, untouched. The drive took 40 minutes, winding through national forest land on roads that grew progressively narrower and rougher. Ray navigated from memory, occasionally consulting a hand-drawn map he'd sketched the night before using coordinates from the 1987 property records. They passed a handful of scattered homesteads, seasonal cabins mostly, windows shuttered, no vehicles in the driveways. This far from town, most properties were only occupied during hunting season or summer holidays. Vare's place is another 2 miles in, Ray said, breaking the silence. Back in '87, the road was worse than this. Took us an hour just to get out here for the interview. Did you get a bad feeling from him when you talked to him? Ray was quiet for a moment, considering. Not bad, exactly. More like closed off. He answered our questions but didn't volunteer anything. Kept his arms crossed the whole time, wouldn't invite us past the porch. Some people are just private, especially out here. But combined with his refusal to let us search the property, it stuck with me. You think he had something to hide? I think he didn't want anyone on his land. Whether that was because of Daniel and Mariah or just general paranoia, I couldn't say. Vietnam vets, especially ones who came back damaged, sometimes just wanted to be left alone. We had no evidence, no probable cause. We had to respect that. Harper understood the logic, but it frustrated her. How many cases went unsolved because someone's privacy was protected when they didn't deserve it? How many victims stayed hidden because investigators couldn't cross a legal threshold? The 4Runner hit a deep rut, jarring them both. Ray slowed to a crawl as the road deteriorated into little more than 2 tire tracks through overgrown grass and scrub oak. Branches scraped against the doors. The forest pressed in close on both sides, dense and shadowed despite the morning light. This is it, Ray said, pointing ahead. Through the trees, Harper could make out a clearing and the dark shape of a structure. Ray pulled off what passed for a road and parked behind a stand of pines out of sight from the cabin. He killed the engine and they sat for a moment, listening. Birds called from the canopy. Wind rustled through aspen leaves. No other sounds. The property was sold after Vare died, Ray said quietly, consulting notes he'd printed. Went to a bank, then to a real estate company that specializes in rural parcels. According to county records, it's been vacant since 2003. No electricity, no water service. Taxes are current, but barely. The company's probably just holding it until land values rise enough to make a sale worthwhile. So no one's been here in over 2 years. Shouldn't be, but we'll be careful anyway. They got out quietly, easing the doors shut rather than slamming them. Ray had brought a camera, binoculars, and Harper noticed his service pistol in a hip holster under his jacket. She didn't comment on it. They weren't law enforcement anymore. They were trespassing on private property with no legal authority. If they found something significant, they'd have to be extremely careful about how they documented it to avoid contaminating evidence or violating search and seizure laws. Ray led the way through the trees, moving slowly, pausing frequently to listen. Harper followed, her heart thudding against her ribs. The clearing opened up ahead of them, about an acre of flat ground, overgrown with tall grass and wildflowers gone to seed. In the center stood a cabin. It was small, maybe 20 feet by 30, built from rough-cut logs chinked with concrete that had cracked and crumbled in places. The roof was corrugated metal, rusted orange and sagging in the middle. 2 windows faced the clearing, both dark and empty. The front door hung slightly crooked on its hinges. Behind the main cabin, Harper could see the corner of another structure, partially obscured by trees. "Outbuilding," Ray murmured, following her gaze. "Maybe a shed or workshop." They approached carefully, staying low, though it quickly became obvious no one was here. The grass around the cabin was knee-high and undisturbed except by deer trails. The porch steps were rotted through in places, treacherous. Ray tested his weight before climbing up, and Harper followed. The front door wasn't locked. The latch was broken, hanging loose. Ray pushed it open and they stepped inside. The interior was dim, light filtering weakly through dirty windows. It smelled of mildew, mouse droppings, and decay. The main room held basic furniture: a sagging couch, a wooden table with 2 chairs, a pot-belly stove in the corner. A narrow doorway led to what looked like a bedroom. Everything was covered in dust and debris, leaves that had blown in, chunks of fallen ceiling insulation, evidence of animals nesting. Harper's eyes adjusted slowly. This wasn't right. The walls were wrong. Logs, not the rough planks from the Polaroids. The windows were at normal height, not high up near the ceiling. The floor was wooden, not dirt. She felt a sharp stab of disappointment. "This isn't it," she said. Ray was examining the walls, running his hand along the logs. "The main cabin isn't. But remember, there's an outbuilding. Let's check that before we rule this place out." They moved through the cabin quickly, confirming it was abandoned and undisturbed. The bedroom held a rusted metal bed frame and a dresser with empty drawers. No personal items, nothing to indicate anyone had lived here recently. The bank had probably cleared out Vare's possessions after he died. Outside, they circled around back. The outbuilding sat about 50 feet from the main cabin, partially hidden by overgrown juniper bushes. It was smaller than the cabin, maybe 12 feet square, and built differently. Rough plank walls, exactly like in the photos. Harper's breath caught. The door was padlocked, but the lock was old and rusted. Ray examined it, then pulled a multi-tool from his pocket. "If anyone asks, we found it open." He worked at the lock for a minute before it gave way with a metallic snap. The door swung outward with a groan of corroded hinges. Ray pulled a flashlight from his jacket and shined it inside. Harper looked over his shoulder and felt the world tilt. The interior matched the Polaroids exactly. Rough plank walls with gaps between them. A dirt floor, packed hard and uneven. Wooden beams overhead still bearing the scars of nails where things had been hung. And high on the back wall, a small window, maybe 2 feet square, positioned exactly where it appeared in the photos. "Jesus," Ray breathed. They stood in the doorway for a long moment, neither moving. Harper's mind was reeling, trying to process the enormity of what they'd found. This was real. This was where Daniel and Mariah had been held. This small, suffocating space had been their prison. Ray stepped inside carefully, shining his light across every surface. The shed was empty now. No furniture, no metal bucket, no sign of what had happened here. But the structure itself was unmistakable. Harper pulled out her phone and brought up the photos of the Polaroids she'd taken. She held them up, comparing. "The angle's right," she said, her voice tight. They were sitting here against this wall. The camera was positioned about here. She moved to where the photographer would have stood. And the light coming through that window matches what's in the photos. Ray was examining the floor, crouching down to study the packed earth. "Harper, look at this." She joined him. He was pointing at discoloration in the dirt, darker patches irregularly shaped that could have been anything or nothing. But when Ray scraped at one with his knife, the dirt came away darker underneath, almost black. Could be old oil stains, he said. Or water damage, or blood, Harper finished. We'd need forensics to confirm that. But yes, possibly. Ray photographed the area extensively, using a ruler for scale, marking the locations with small evidence flags he'd brought. He worked methodically, professionally, documenting everything the way he'd been trained. Harper explored the rest of the shed, looking for anything else that might be significant. The walls showed scratch marks in places, some that looked deliberate, like someone had tried to carve into the wood. She photographed those too. In one corner, she found what looked like a piece of frayed rope, so old and brittle it crumbled when she touched it. Ray bagged it carefully. They worked for over an hour, documenting every detail, taking measurements, creating a comprehensive photographic record. When they were finally done, Ray stood in the center of the shed and looked around one more time. "This is enough," he said. "We have the Polaroid showing Daniel and Mariah in a structure that matches this one exactly. We have the location on property owned by a person of interest who was evasive during the original investigation. We have potential physical evidence. It's time to bring in the authorities." Harper wanted to keep searching, to tear the property apart until she found more answers, but she knew Ray was right. They'd done what they could legally do as civilians. Going further would risk compromising any future prosecution. They locked the shed as best they could and headed back to the Forerunner. Harper took one last look at the property as they drove away. Somewhere on these 50 acres, her brother and his wife had spent their final days. The mountain she'd always blamed, the rocks, the ravines, the wilderness, had been innocent all along. The real killer had been human, deliberate, evil. The drive back to Ridgemont was tense. Ray was already mentally composing what he'd say to the sheriff, how he'd present the evidence to make the strongest possible case for reopening the investigation. Harper stared out the window, feeling simultaneously vindicated and hollowed out. She'd been right for 18 years. Everyone who'd told her to let it go, to accept the accident theory, had been wrong. But being right didn't bring Daniel back. Ray drove straight to the Ridgemont County Sheriff's Department, a low brick building on the edge of town. It was just past 10 a.m. when they pulled into the parking lot. Ray grabbed the case file and the ammo box, both carefully secured in evidence bags he'd prepared. "Let me do the talking initially," he told Harper. "I know how to navigate this. If they want to hear from you directly, I'll signal." Inside, the department was quiet, just a few deputies moving between offices. The receptionist recognized Ray immediately and waved them through. Ray asked for Sheriff Tom Brennan, and they were directed to his office in the back. Brennan was in his early 50s, fit and competent looking, with the careful expression of someone used to dealing with difficult situations. He stood when they entered, shaking Ray's hand warmly. "Ray, good to see you. It's been, 6 months? How's retirement treating you?" "Keeping me busy, Tom. This is Harper Keene. I need to talk to you about an old case. The Daniel and Mariah Keene disappearance from 1987. Brennan's expression shifted to professional curiosity. He gestured for them to sit. "I know the case. Happened before my time here, but I've seen the file. Tragic accident. What about it?" Ray set the evidence bags on the desk. "Harper found something yesterday while hiking Cloud Spine Ridge. Something that changes everything we thought we knew about that case." For the next 30 minutes, Ray walked Brennan through the discovery, the rock slide, the hidden ammo box, the Polaroids dated July 18th. He explained their investigation of Marcus Vare's property and the shed that matched the photos. Brennan listened intently, occasionally asking questions, his expression growing grimmer as the scope of the information became clear. When Ray finished, Brennan sat back and was quiet for a long moment. Then he looked at Harper. "Ms. Keene, I'm very sorry for your loss and for the fact that the original investigation missed this." "It's not about apologies," Harper said. "It's about finding out what happened, about getting justice for Daniel and Mariah." "Understood, and I intend to do exactly that." Brennan picked up his phone and made a call, requesting his lead detective and the department's evidence custodian to come to his office immediately. "We're reopening this case as of right now. Ray, I'll need you to provide a full statement about your investigation yesterday. Ms. Keene, same for you. We'll need to secure the Vare property, get forensics out there, start tracking down anyone who knew Marcus Vare." The afternoon became a blur of statements and interviews. Harper recounted finding the ammo box multiple times, each iteration recorded and transcribed. A forensics team was dispatched to the Vare property with a warrant obtained on an emergency basis. The Polaroids and the watch and pendant were logged into evidence and sent to the state crime lab for analysis. By evening, the sheriff's department had transformed into a command center for the reopened investigation. Officers were pulling old files, cross-referencing property records, tracking down former associates of Marcus Vare. Brennan had called in detectives from the state police to assist, acknowledging that his small department needed additional resources for a case this old and complex. Harper sat in a conference room with Ray, both of them exhausted but wired on adrenaline and bad coffee. Detective Sarah Chen, one of the state investigators, joined them to discuss next steps. "We've confirmed that Marcus Vare died in 2003 from cirrhosis of the liver," Chen said, reading from notes on her laptop. "He was living alone, no next of kin. The property sat in probate for a year before being sold to satisfy debts. We're tracking down the attorney who handled the estate, seeing if there are any personal effects in storage that weren't disposed of." "What about people who knew him?" Harper asked. "Friends, associates, anyone who might have known what he was doing out there?" "We're working on that. From what we can tell so far, Vare was a loner. Vietnam vet, honorable discharge in 1972, drifted around for a few years before buying that property in 1980. He had a few arrests for minor offenses, drunk and disorderly, one assault charge that was dropped, but no serious criminal history and no known associates in the area. So he acted alone," Ray said. "Possibly, or he was good at keeping his activities private." Chen looked at Harper. "The forensics team found what they believe are bloodstains in the shed, along with additional evidence of long-term occupancy, rope fibers, fabric fragments, what looks like remnants of food packaging. They're processing everything now, but preliminary indications are that people were held in that structure for an extended period." Harper felt sick. "How long?" "We won't know for certain until we complete the analysis. But the Polaroids are dated July 18th, 4 days after your brother disappeared. If Vare kept them longer than that." Chen didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. "We need to search the rest of the property," Harper said. "If Daniel and Mariah died there, their remains might still be on that land." "We have cadaver dogs coming in tomorrow morning," Chen assured her. "We'll search every inch of those 50 acres. If there's anything to find, we'll find it." The meeting continued for another hour, but Harper was barely present for it. Her mind was stuck on the image of that shed, of Daniel and Mariah trapped inside, waiting for a rescue that never came. She'd been 16 years old, sitting in algebra class worrying about track meets and college applications, while her brother was dying somewhere in the mountains. Ray drove her back to his house after the meeting. Neither of them spoke much. The weight of the day, of the 18 years leading up to this day, was too heavy for words. "You should call your mother," Ray said as he pulled into his driveway, "before she hears about this from the news." Harper nodded. She'd been avoiding that thought, but Ray was right. Barbara Keene deserved to hear it from her daughter, not from a television reporter or a phone call from a stranger. Inside, Harper sat at Ray's kitchen table and dialed her mother's number in Arizona. Barbara answered on the second ring, her voice bright and unsuspecting. "Harper, honey, this is a surprise. How are you?" "Mom, I need to tell you something about Daniel." The brightness drained from Barbara's voice instantly. "What about Daniel?" Harper took a breath and told her. She tried to be gentle to soften the horror, but there was no way to make it easier. Her mother listened in silence, and Harper could hear when the moment came that Barbara started crying. Soft, broken sounds that carried across the distance between them. "I always knew," Barbara said finally, her voice thick. I always knew it wasn't an accident. Everyone told me I was in denial, that I couldn't accept he was gone, but I knew. A mother knows. I'm sorry, Mom. I'm so sorry I couldn't find this sooner. Don't apologize, you never gave up. You found the truth when everyone else had stopped looking. Barbara was quiet for a moment. Are they searching for his remains? Starting tomorrow. I'll call you as soon as I know anything. They talked for a few more minutes, Barbara asking questions Harper couldn't yet answer, both of them crying and trying to comfort each other across 1,000 miles. When Harper finally hung up, she felt emptied out, scraped raw. Ray had made more coffee and set a cup in front of her without comment. They sat together in silence as the evening darkened into night, two people bound by a case that had defined both their lives in different ways. The next morning, Harper drove out to the Vare property with Ray, following the official convoy of sheriff's vehicles and forensic vans. The property had been secured overnight with crime scene tape and a deputy posted at the access road. Now, in the bright morning light, it looked different. Not mysterious or threatening, just sad. A place where terrible things had happened and been hidden. The cadaver dogs arrived at 9 a.m., 2 German shepherds and their handlers from a specialized unit out of Denver. Harper watched from a distance as they worked, the dogs moving methodically across the property in grid patterns, their handlers watching for any sign of alert behavior. It took less than an hour. One of the dogs stopped at the tree line about 100 yards behind the shed, nosing at the ground, and then sitting, the signal that it had detected human remains. The handler marked the spot with a flag and called for the forensics team. They moved in with ground-penetrating radar and carefully began excavating. Harper stood with Ray at the edge of the clearing, unable to look away and unable to move closer. Sheriff Brennan stood nearby, his radio crackling with updates from the dig site. The excavation was slow, painstaking work. They'd brought in an anthropologist from the state university to supervise. By early afternoon, they'd found the first remains. 2 bodies, buried in a shallow grave, wrapped in deteriorated plastic sheeting. The forensics team worked through the afternoon, carefully exposing and documenting everything before removal. Harper didn't need to see them to know. She felt it in her bones, in the way Brennan's expression shifted when he received the radio update, in the way Ray put a hand on her shoulder and squeezed gently. We'll need dental records for positive identification, Brennan told her quietly. But based on the clothing fragments and personal items found with the remains, we believe it's Daniel and Mariah. Harper nodded, unable to speak. After 18 years of searching, of refusing to give up, of being told she was obsessed and unable to let go, she'd finally found them. The relief was overwhelming, and so was the grief. They weren't lost anymore. They weren't fallen somewhere unreachable in the wilderness. They were here, and they could finally come home. There's something else, Brennan said. The anthropologist found evidence of trauma to both skulls. Blunt force, probably fatal. This wasn't starvation or neglect. Vare killed them deliberately. So that was how it ended. After days of terror and captivity, of hoping someone would find them, Daniel and Mariah had been murdered. Harper closed her eyes and let the tears come. She'd held them back for so long, stayed strong through so many disappointments and dead ends. But now, standing in the place where her brother died, she allowed herself to break. Ray stayed close, a steady presence. The excavation continued through the late afternoon. By evening, both sets of remains had been carefully removed and transported to the medical examiner's office for formal identification and autopsy. The forensics team would continue processing the gravesite and the surrounding area for additional evidence. As the sun set over the mountains, Harper stood alone at the edge of the clearing, looking out at the forest. Marcus Vare was dead. He'd never face trial, never be forced to answer for what he'd done. But the truth was out now. Daniel and Mariah's story wouldn't end with speculation and unanswered questions. The world would know they'd been victims of a crime, not an accident. They would be remembered correctly. Ready to go? Ray asked, approaching quietly. Harper nodded. They walked back to the Forerunner together, leaving the crime scene behind. Tomorrow would bring more interviews, more processing, more slow revelation of details. But tonight, Harper just wanted to sit quietly and remember her brother as he'd been before that July day in 1987. Laughing, alive, full of plans and dreams and futures that never came to be. The drive back to Ridgemont was quiet. Ray dropped Harper off at a motel in town where she'd rented a room since she couldn't bring herself to stay at his house another night. She needed to be alone. Inside the small, anonymous room, Harper sat on the bed and opened her laptop. The news had already broken. Local stations were running stories about the reopened case, the discovery of remains, the decades-old mystery finally solved. Harper watched the reports with a strange sense of detachment, seeing her own story told by strangers who didn't know Daniel, who couldn't understand what had been lost. Her phone buzzed with messages, friends who'd seen the news, her mother calling again, reporters requesting interviews. Harper ignored them all. Tomorrow she would deal with the world's questions and demands. Tonight belonged to grief. She pulled out the notebook she'd kept for 18 years, the one filled with maps and timelines and theories. She flipped through the pages, seeing her younger self's handwriting evolve from the neat script of a teenager to the hurried scrawl of an adult consumed by obsession. Every page represented hours of work, days of searching, years of refusing to give up. Harper turned to a blank page at the back and picked up a pen. She wrote a single sentence. Daniel and Mariah, found July 15, 2005. Then she closed the notebook and set it aside. The search was over. The truth had been found. Whatever came next, the investigations, the media attention, the slow process of burial and grief, she would face it. But for tonight, she allowed herself to simply sit with the knowledge that she'd kept her promise. She'd never stopped looking, and she'd found them. 3 months later, Harper stood at the entrance to Ridgemont Cemetery, holding 2 bundles of wildflowers she'd picked that morning from the meadows along Cloudspine Ridge. The October air was crisp and clear, the aspens blazing gold against an impossibly blue sky. It was the kind of day Daniel had loved, the kind of day he and Mariah had set out to enjoy 18 years ago. The funeral had been small, attended by family and a few close friends who still remembered. Barbara had flown in from Arizona, frail but determined, and had held Harper's hand throughout the service. The caskets, sealed, at the medical examiner's recommendation, had been laid to rest side by side under a spreading oak tree. The headstones were simple, black granite, bearing their names and dates and a shared inscription Barbara had chosen. Together always. Harper walked the familiar path through the cemetery, past rows of weathered markers and fresh graves, until she reached the oak tree. Someone had left flowers recently. Ray probably, or maybe one of Daniel's old college friends. Harper set her wildflowers against the headstones and sat down on the grass between them. "I finished it," she said quietly. "The investigation, I mean. They closed the case last week. The final forensic reports had confirmed what everyone suspected. Daniel and Mariah had died from blunt force trauma to their skulls, killed sometime between July 18th and July 20th, 1987. The evidence suggested they'd been held in the shed for at least 4 days before Vare murdered them and buried their bodies in the woods. DNA recovered from the shed matched both victims. Additional evidence found in Vare's cabin, including a Polaroid camera and undeveloped film, definitively linked him to the crime. The why remained elusive. Vare had left no confession, no diary, no explanation. Detective Chen's theory, based on witness interviews and Vare's psychological profile, was that the abduction had been opportunistic. Vare had seen Daniel and Mariah at the trailhead, followed them, and taken them at gunpoint somewhere along the trail. The motive appeared to be control. He'd kept them alive for days, photographing them, exerting power over them. When the search intensified and the risk of discovery grew too high, he'd eliminated the evidence. Some questions would never be answered, but the core truth was known now, documented and irrefutable. Daniel and Mariah hadn't fallen. They'd been murdered, and Harper had proven it. "Mom wanted me to tell you she's doing okay," Harper continued. "She's thinking about moving back to Colorado, maybe next spring. Says she's tired of the desert, wants to be closer to you." A breeze rustled through the oak leaves above her, golden and whispering. Harper tilted her face up to catch the sunlight, letting it warm her skin. The grief was still there, would probably always be there, but it felt different now. Bearable. She'd carried the weight of not knowing for so long that even terrible knowledge felt lighter than uncertainty. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. Harper pulled it out and saw a text from Ray. "Coffee tomorrow? Want to discuss something?" She smiled slightly and typed back, "Sure. Your place, 9 a.m.? Ray had become something like family over these past months, the only person who truly understood what the last 18 years had cost her. They'd spent countless hours together as the investigation concluded, reviewing evidence, giving statements, supporting each other through the difficult revelations. He'd stood beside her at the funeral, a steady presence when everything else felt unmoored. Harper pocketed her phone and stood, brushing grass from her jeans. She touched each headstone gently, the granite cool and smooth under her fingers. "I love you both," she said. "I never stopped looking, and I never will stop remembering." She walked back through the cemetery as the afternoon sun stretched shadows long across the ground. At the entrance, she paused and looked back one more time. The oak tree stood dark against the bright sky, sheltering the two graves beneath it. Together, always. Harper got in her truck and drove away, heading toward the mountains that rose blue and distant on the horizon. The Cloud Spine Ridge Trail was still there, still open to hikers who didn't know its history. The overlook where everyone had thought Daniel and Mariah fell was still marked on maps as a scenic viewpoint. But Harper knew the truth now. The mountain had kept their secret for 18 years, not because it was guilty, but because someone had used its vastness to hide evil. The wilderness was innocent. It had always been innocent. She pulled onto the highway and accelerated, the truck's engine humming as she drove toward whatever came next. The search was over. The truth was known. Daniel and Mariah could finally rest, and Harper could finally begin to live with something other than obsession. She could live with memory and peace, and the quiet certainty that love had driven her to keep looking when everyone else had stopped. The mountains rose ahead of her, beautiful and indifferent, keeping their remaining secrets while surrendering this one. Harper drove toward them, no longer searching, just remembering.